All right, we are going to do gathers now. So for the sample, I have a piece of muslin that measures 2 inches by 6 inches long. I also have a piece of muslin that is 6 inches wide by 18 inches long. And I'm going to take this really big piece here and I'm going to scrunch it up and fit it on to this piece here. So first what I'm going to do is I'm going to put my 2x6 aside, and I need to prep my big piece to be able to fit onto my small piece. And to do that, I'm going to change the length of my stitch on my machine up to a 4, 3.5 to 4. And then what I'm going to do, I have 1/2 inch seam allowances here. So what I'm going to do is I am going to sew a line from one end to the other exactly at 1/4 inch. And being precise on this is important. So at exactly 1/4 inch, I'm going to sew from here all the way to here, all the way to the other side. And this is one of those few times where you do not backstitch. And make sure that you have nice long thread tails to begin with. So do not backstitch, make sure you have thread tails at the beginning and at the end. So I've given myself some more nice long thread tails. I'm going to do that again, and this time I'm going to space it 1/4 inch from my last line of stitching. So my first row was 1/4 inch from the cut edge of the fabric, and now I'm going to do another row 1/4 inch from there so that I end up with 2 parallel lines of stitching. Now that I've done it twice, I'm going to do it one more time. And 3, you can get away with only doing 2 rows of stitching, specifically if you're doing something with fabric that pin marks, then getting away with 2 lines of stitching is good. But if you can do more, because your stitching is not going to leave little marks on the fabric, I would encourage you to do 3 lines because you end up with a lot more control and your gathers ultimately end up looking a lot better. Make sure all of your ends stay out of the way. And notice I didn't go all the way to the edge actually, and I usually don't. Usually what happens is this edge right here has 1/2 inch seam allowance as well, or some amount of seam allowance, and I usually stop my gathers right at the seam allowance, right at that style line. So you don't have to go all the way to the edge, and in fact, you usually won't. So now that I have 3 lines of stitching exactly 1/4 inch apart, I need to find the middle. So you can mark the middle of your fabric at the beginning if you want with just a pencil, or you can come back now and just pin it. So I've found the middle just by folding my fabric in half. And then I'm also going to find the quarters. So I'll take one edge and I'll line it up with that middle. And the reason I'm doing this is so that I can keep my gathers organized. I need to be able to keep my gathers evenly spaced. I need to have several registration points. And if you are working on a pattern, they will usually include these registration points for you in the form of notches. But since I don't have notches on this, I'm just going to split this into 4 even quarters. So that I know where to line it up on my piece. So I've gotten that all divided up. So now I'm going to grab my 2x6 piece of muslin and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to divide it in half. In quarter. And then quarter again. Now, once I've done this, I am ready to gather. The gathers that I have here, I have basically taken the dimension from here, this 6-inch dimension. That looks fuggy. Hopefully that doesn't stay fuzzy on the screen. Anyhow, there we are. Okay, sorry about that. I've taken the dimension here, this 6-inch dimension, and multiplied it by 3 to get the full length from here all the way over to here. Which means I will be gathering, this is a 3-to-1 ratio. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this middle pin that I have here, and I'm going to line it up with the middle of my 6-inch piece. So I've got it pinned, I can take one of the pins out. And then I'm going to line up the quarter and pin that. Pay attention to which direction you're pinning. You'd never want to pin this direction, going along the seam. That's going to make it hard for you to sew it and hard for you to gather it. I'll line up my other quarter. And then I'm going to line up my ends. And I'm going to make sure that my pin lines up right with where my thread ends have finished. So I'm not lining it up out here, I'm lining it up right where I stopped stitching. I'm going to do that on both sides. As much as you can, try to keep your thread tails organized and together at all times so they're not flying away, so it's easy to tell where they are. Okay, so I am ready to start gathering. And what I'm going to do to begin with is I'm going to get all of the top threads and separate them from the bottom threads. So they're completely separate, like that. Here's the bottom threads. The top threads are hanging out up here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to start pulling them. And you can start to see how it's making the fabric bunch up. And you'll just have to figure out, it comes with practice, how to move that thread along. Make sure you don't pull too tight and snap a thread. It's always a pain to snap a thread because you have to go back and ungather and restitch to make it look really pretty. Once I have gathered it up to the point that it's no longer, it's going to start condensing the back piece as well, because I don't want this 2x6 piece to gather. I just want the front piece to gather. So once it has gotten to the point where it's going to start bunching up the back, I take these top threads that I just finished with and I'm going to wrap them around my needle just in a figure-8 pattern. Like that. And then I can come back and I can spend some time with the gathers that I've actually done. And I can make sure that they are all nice and evenly spaced. Once I've done it to this side, I'm going to flip it around and I'm going to come in from the other side, grab those top threads from this side, and do the same thing. I'll just start pulling it. Try to pull all 3 threads evenly so that they don't bunch it up at an uneven rate. It's a lot easier to make sure that you just pull them all at the same rate. Gathering can sometimes be really tedious, but it also can just be really satisfying too when you have a whole bunch of really nicely, evenly gathered gathers. Make sure that I'm not condensing that back piece. Once I have pulled it as much as I need to, I'm going to figure eight the top threads onto my pin. Place it down, reorganize all of my little gathers here. And then I am ready to sew them down. When you're doing this, you are laying stuff down right sides together, by the way. I didn't mention that at the beginning. But what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna start stitching this down, and I need to change my stitch length back to a 2.5. And then, since my seam allowance is 1/2 inch, I'm going to just sew at a 1/2 inch, which will line up with this line of stitching. So this middle line of gather stitching. And what I'll probably do is I'll aim my needle to be a thread's width towards all of the gathers so that this little thread doesn't show up on the exterior. But what I'm going to do is I'll start with a back stitch because this is putting it into place and it's trying to keep it there. So I'm going to start with a back stitch. And right before I go over the figure eight, I take the pin out and I pull all of those threads out of the way so that I'm not sewing over them. And then I'm just sewing right along my line of stitching, taking my pins out as I go, right before the needle comes down on top of them so that I don't accidentally snap my needle or my pins. Make sure all of my threads are out of the way. And right when I get to the other pin, the final pin, I pull it out and get rid of that figure eight of thread so it's all nice and neat. Tie a knot, and I'm good to go. So now when I open it up, I have a whole bunch of gathers sewn in to this piece of fabric. Looks like a little dirndl skirt or something like that. But I now don't want this black thread showing down here. So it really was there just for us to help sew. So I can come back here to the back side where I pulled on it already, and it is set and ready for me to just take it out. Once I've taken it out, it removes the piece from the front as well. And I have some nice little gathers, just like that. And that is how you do the gathers. When you press gathers, take the iron and you take the point of the iron and you stab up into all of the gathers. You never want to put the iron down right on top of it because that presses them and they lose that puffy structure of a gather. So we never want to get rid of that. So always take your iron if you're going to press and do some ironing on it. Take it up into between all of those gathers and it'll stay really pretty.